Chair, Dan Saltzman. And for those who are used to hearing me welcome you to Children's Investment Fund meetings, we've changed our name. We are now the Portland Children's Levy. And we did that for a couple of reasons. First, we think it's the name that most Portlanders recognize us by, having voted twice, both in 2002 and again in 2008, to overwhelmingly renew the Children's Levy. We felt it made more sense for us to conform our name with the name that people recognize and associate with us. And we believe it more accurately does explain what we are and what we're all about. So the name change coincides with other initiatives we will be making, including a facelift of the Children's Levy website, an e-newsletter, and a Portland Children's Levy Facebook page. That'll be said, we're not doing our best. No Twitter yet, but Facebook.
No Twitter.
So we'll try to remember our new name as we proceed. I realize we're going to slip up once in a while, but as I said, let's do our best. And so getting started, I'd like to introduce my colleagues on the allocation committee. And again, we're in a less formal format here today, but I want to introduce Alyssa Kinney-Geyer, who is the Citizens Representative for the City of Portland. Adrienne Livingston, who is the Citizens Representative for Multnomah County, and Ron Belts, who is a citizen member representing the Portland Business Alliance. Multnomah County Chair Ted Wheeler had a previously scheduled engagement in Salem, so he will not be able to join us today. Moving on to the Children's Levy staff, Lisa Pellegrino in the center is the program director, and Lisa Hansel on my immediate right oversees foster care as well as child abuse prevention and intervention. We have communications director Mary Gay Broderick, and we have fiscal specialist John Kelly. And so, as I do at all of our meetings, I just want to give a quick history of the Children's Levy. This is our first meeting since we approved more than $36 million in funding last spring for 69 proven programs serving 16,000 Portland children and their families in the areas of early childhood, after-school and mentoring programs, child abuse prevention and intervention programs, and we are now helping children who are in foster care succeed as well. A 5% administrative cap means that 95% of the levy goes directly to the programs that achieve positive results for children. While we have a leverage fund that to date has recruited or has leveraged private and public investments of $6 million during the first 5 years of the levy. And in continuing with the successful venture, last spring, this committee designated an additional $3 million for a future leverage fund, which is on our agenda today to talk about that. So I'd like to begin the meeting, even though this is a less formal work session, we will, as we always do at our meetings, afford an opportunity for public comment at the beginning of this meeting. So if there's anybody who wishes to speak to us for a couple minutes about anything, this is your opportunity.
In your chair?
Okay, I don't see any takers. Okay, so we are going to cover two topics. One is sort of a debrief on how we felt the investment process or allocation process went. Thanks, Rose. In the last 6 months. And then we're also going to discuss the leverage fund and guidelines for our leverage fund going forward. So I'm going to turn it over now to Lisa Pellegrino to take it away there. get us started.
Okie doke. I'm going to actually turn it back over to the other Lisa. She's going to start with looking at kind of a debrief of the funding process and explain how we're going to go about it. And just to remind folks, we're not voting on anything today. This is for discussion purposes, and Mary Gay will be our lovely scribe.
That reminds me, we do have to vote on the minutes.
Oh, whoops, except for the minutes. I missed
So I'll
that.
take a motion to accept our minutes from, was it July 9th?
I move we accept our minutes from June 9th. I second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Okay, the minutes are approved.
Okay,
Okay,
vote,
sorry.
Okay, go ahead, take it away, Lisa.
All right, so as we said, the first thing we'll talk about is a debrief of the competitive bid process that we just finished up. We'll start by identifying issues. Staff has a few issues that were included in the memo. We'd like to start by just briefly describing two of those issues and then ask for allocation committee members to add to the list. Mary Gay will put the list up as we discuss the items. From there, we'll move to prioritizing the items on the list, as we only have time probably to discuss 3 to 4 of those items in depth. And then discuss improvements and alternatives for the future in terms of funding. So that's, any questions about the process? Mm-hmm. Pretty straightforward. Just kind of jump into 2 of the issues that staff has identified upon reflection. The first is really the issue between funding new programs and current or previously funded programs. When we entered and offered an open competitive bid process, that really gives the impression that new programs or requests for expanding existing programs were all, had a fair chance at receiving funding. In the end, staff recommended and allocation committee members gave preference towards continued funding of programs that were there were no issues with, and for a variety of really good reasons that happened. But at the same time, that limited the amount of funding for new or expanded programming. In the memo, there's a chart that illustrates what those percentages are, and excluding foster care, since that was a new program area, so those funds would be for new programs by and large. Across all program funding areas, excluding foster care, 42% of the funding that was requested was for new programs, and in the end, 13% of the funding that was awarded was for new programs. So there's a difference there, as well as nearly almost all of the continuing grantees had requested expansion dollars, about 95% of the programs, and about 5% of those requests were funded. So very little in terms of new or expansion funds. We raised
5% of existing programs who proposed
so about
expansion of the existing program. Only 5%
received expansion. So you remember basically we used a formula for continued funding with the COLAs and up to 15% of admin. And by and large, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 programs that received funding in excess of that, and there were a couple of programs that received a little bit less than that current level funding. But by and large, the funding was for current level funding with those adjustments. And we raised this issue because applying for funds is a great investment of time on behalf of the applicants, all of you, the reviewers, and staff. So to really, think about some other options for how to deal with new and expanded funding versus current grantee continuing funding seems like a good use of time on everyone's part to really think about, are there alternatives that could work out better for everyone?
In case you need it, in our packets is a list of the programs we did fund, just in case anybody's memory needs to be.
I'm going to ask Mary Gay to put that issue up on the list. So we're going to try to get a little,
So
right,
new versus
so new versus continuing programs is a significant issue that I would suspect is probably on many people's mental agenda.
Did you have anything to add to that issue at this point?
No.
I have just a little bit, and this will probably be another discussion as far as administrative costs, because we have a little bit different viewpoint. But that percentage that you gave, I think, skews a little bit at only 5% expansion. Is that the statistic?
It's 5%. It's done by the number of applications or applicants. Does that make sense? Not by dollars. We did not go
Not by
back
dollars.
and figure out, because that's a major calculation. If you're going to figure out what would have been continuing, how much did they request, how many more dollars would have been expansion, and how many of those dollars got funded, it just wasn't really worth spending the time on figuring out the money. But of the applicants that requested expansion, which were 95% of the ones that applied, that were already current grantees, only 5% of those were funded to expand their programs.
But I think you bring up a good point. We didn't expand delivery of programs. We didn't increase the program, but we did, because of that change in administrative rate, slightly increase the amount of funding that they got to deliver those programs. So there wasn't program expansion, but there was slightly more money in our current grantees that went toward that.
Assuming their administrative rate went up, which
Correct.
isn't necessarily the case for everybody.
But
yes.
some did. For instance,
yes.
one of the ones that we had disagreements about, for instance, would be if it was a $1 or $1.5 million program that previously had a 5% admin. 10% of $1.5 million is a lot of money. That's another $150,000. So we did deliver a lot more money to a number of existing grantees.
Yes. Yes. I just wanted to be clear. It wasn't for program expansion. Because that's where I guess the reason we point that up is because it takes a lot of time to sit there and write applications and create budgets for expanded programs that have nothing to do with admin. So they spent a lot of time creating all of this paperwork for an expanded version of what they're doing. Often they include different services, so that requires research on those. I mean, there's just a lot to that in terms of effort, and so that was kind of our reason for pointing that up. Not that we did give more money for admin, which kind of leads us to our second issue.
So administrative rates.
Administrative
is the second issue.
rates
We're
is
just
the
listing.
Yeah, we're just
Right.
listing. I mean, so I do want to discuss,
Right.
but let's at least list, because I want to hear your ideas. We put some things down on paper, but I want to. If there's other things that people want to discuss, I want to make sure we get those out.
Well, I thought the format for funding allocation meetings, which you all listed, is a good one. And then
So, I mean, we're just
We're
go
just-
ahead and put admin rates up there. I mean, that's clearly one issue we're going to talk about, and then the format of our meetings.
I mean, we could just list all the ones that you put, because
Well,
these are.
only if they're important to talk about for you. I mean, I didn't. We did put them down because these were things that kind of shown
Okay.
up for us, or things that other people commented on that we want to make sure kind of you, or that we received maybe in some cases, like for instance around reviewers, we got a fair amount of feedback from them. We wanted to kind of make sure you heard that, and then also kind of those miscellaneous things. Those were just things that staff has been percolating, and we wanted to not miss those.
I think
Well, let's wait and see. Are there any other issues besides what we listed that people think we ought to be talking about?
I think the one I might add, but I also think it fits into the first point, it really is, how do we balance current and new grant proposals, as well as I think a perception that well-known organizations have a leg up over less well-known organizations. I mean, so those are perceptions. I think they do fit under the first heading of our broad-based discussion.
Yeah, I think we should definitely talk about those issues under that, because that's a part of it, I think.
And I think in our meeting format, I assume that kind of encompasses the issue of people really, or us better articulating how we made decisions, and the fact that scores were really one criteria,
Right.
not,
I have that as
criteria.
kind of included under format for funding allocation meetings. And then the other thing is just this sheet on diversity I wanted to discuss. I don't know if that fits under that as well. I have a suggestion for that.
Or we could just put it under the RFI. I mean, I think if you have any questions or improvements for the RFI itself.
Which one? Did we already lift that?
No, I just put RFI. Put RFI, because if there's anyone else has other.
Under your miscellaneous, the technical assistance for application writing.
Okay. Anything else that folks wanted to raise? Okay. Which first?
Yeah, which,
Well, let's talk about.
Do you want to go down the list? Do you
Yeah,
want
let's
to
just
raise
go down
something up?
new versus the funding, new versus current programs.
Okay.
Which embedded in that is, perception that more well-known organizations have a leg up over less well-known organizations. And how do we want to consider alternatives? I think we pretty much, as an allocation committee, decided this time around that we were going to require everybody to compete, regardless of whether they had been funded by us in the past. Because I know staff, I think at one time, had come forward with an initial recommendation to maybe just do Head Start, straight up renew that, and work with what's left. I think we pretty much rejected that approach. So I guess this is the point to discuss. Do we want to try to do anything different in future requests for investments that deal with some of these issues?
So I'll start. You did a fabulous job, as usual, in laying out the current status as well as some alternative proposals. And so there were 3 that were associated with this. One was to keep the process as we did it this time, which is to have everyone apply at the same time, and to more heavily weight informally the ones that have been performing well. So if the score ends up being lower, we may bump them up because we've been getting a lot of performance reports that show that they're doing a good job. Your second alternative was to let the current grantees apply first and then have a second round and perhaps use that second round with leftover dollars to look at gaps. Am I saying this correctly?
Well, I would say to make what was left over available for new programming that things we're not currently funding.
Right.
Then there's variations on how you could do that. You could make a more directed RFI towards certain things that you wanted to get that were either gaps in the current portfolio or needs in the community potentially, or you could not. You could make it general. I mean, that there's options there. The concept was 2-stage.
Right.
Evaluate current and whether they wanted to continue and how they would continue and at what level,
Right.
and then take what's left over and put that into new.
Right. And then the third one, you're probably better at describing that, is not giving preference at all to current grantees and just basing it more on what their scoring was. And so if current grantees were doing a really good job but they scored lower, we would be looking at everyone the same. Right?
and then
That's
also
kind of
adding the balancing any special populations, geographic or other
So
special
perhaps giving
considerations
scoring
to
a
balance
point
the portfolio.
right.
So it would still be scores. Okay, scores would play a bigger role in that kind of a model, and you would still look at balance. Okay, but you wouldn't be looking at past performance. Really, you wouldn't be looking at the past performance of the grantee. So if somebody scored very poorly, but they were a great performer in the past, you wouldn't fund it probably, unless they had some other key element of balance that you were looking for, like they were a program serving a population that we have no other program serving, and that had shown a lot of need or something like that. I'm just making that up, but
So my inclination would be to go with how we did it this time. I think that it was a fair thing to reward people who have been doing a good job, even if the proposal wasn't really up to par. I always think that if you have tried and true programs and they've been getting their reports into you, that I value that a lot more, which is why I kept saying in the public meetings, take the scores with a grain of salt. This is the score for for reviewers. It's very important, but it's only on how well that proposal met the criteria of the RFP. So I think that when you have several years' experience with an organization, to me, that counts a lot more than what the exact score is. So I didn't like the third option at all. In terms of weighing how we did it versus a 2-step process, I thought it was really valuable to see all of the groups at once. I think if you only look at current grantees and then wait for, even if you have a specific RFI, to pinpoint the needs that we didn't feel were covered by our current grantees and to meet the emerging needs, which in this case were really, east of 82nd Street. We we don't know what's going to be coming in. We don't know how well those things are going to be met. And even though it is more work for the new grantees that were at a disadvantage and didn't get as much funding, clearly they didn't get as, their rate of success was a lot lower than our current grantees. If anything, we could be more clear up front about we are going to give added weight to current grantees that are doing a really good job. We could be more clear, and then it's up to those groups who are applying for, the smaller amount of leftover money to know that they may put a big investment in and they may not get the grant. That unless they're offering something really different than what current grantees are offering, they're less likely to get the grant. I do think if they take that chance, the process of going through writing this proposal puts them in a much stronger position to apply for other grants. So I don't think that it's time completely lost.
So under your, I guess first of all I have a question. I can't recall points that we awarded. Did we award points for? No, I mean, did we award points for being sort of an existing, having a good track record?
No, but that came up in situations where people scored poorly.
Right.
And
no, I know we factored that into our ultimate decisions, but we didn't really have it up front in terms of any kind of points.
It was a bias.
And that's kind of what you're
several
suggesting.
People, right. And I remember saying it during the process, and I don't know if all of the applicants were actually here, but we might, if we agree that that's an important value, we might formalize that so it's not such an informal. Like I was just saying, that's my bias. I'm going to be, when we had the discussion about whether we should have a two-step process last fall, these same questions came up. And my sense was there was a general feeling that we should open it up, we should allow new groups, emerging groups, to be able to compete, but that there would be a value toward continuing to fund groups that have been doing a good job. I felt like that was a general feeling, but we never had a vote. We never attached points to it. I don't know if it's worth formalizing it, but I still think that being able to look at the whole picture then and have people come up like the guy from PSU who said, you have very few Latinos in this particular funding category. Having those kind of things there I thought were helpful.
I think the other issue of a lot of the existing grantees applying for expansion, to really be clear, because the pool of money, even though it may sound large, once you start looking at so many great programs, that really dwindles down so that they know really if you want expansion, it might not necessarily happen just because the pool of money is so small, so that they know, okay, at least go in for your current program. And how we communicate that is to be seen, but I think that should also be clearly communicated so that we don't have 95% of the programs asking for expansion of their program.
Because that was going to be my next question.
I was going to say, I like what you both said, and yet at the same time, I don't think that you want to give current grantees just a green light. But they do need to come back before us, even though our bias may be that they've performed, they've done well. We probably want to refund them, but depending, we may want to take a little away or give a little more, and that they still need to come in for their review. It's not just you're going to get it because you were here before.
Well, there doesn't seem to be any interest in the two-step approach.
It doesn't sound like there's really that much interest in change. You guys are more or less happy with how it went, which is what I was wanting to find out. Are you?
Well, I guess I still don't feel we've really discussed about whether we want to have points or a criteria that explicitly recognizes a good track record as an organization we invested. Is it?
Well,
are you all saying you don't want to do that? You want to just kind of do it the way we did it, where we kind of recognized if there was an organization that maybe didn't score so well, but we knew had a good track record, we just did it at the allocation committee, even though it left some people in the audience wondering, and that gets back to our explanation of how we make our decisions. But I guess is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I think even with what Alyssa said is really clearly spelling that out in the application, that another criteria that's going to be taken into consideration is the fact that for those grantees that we have that are proving to be successful in what they're doing, that we're also going to weight that. Not necessarily, maybe talking about the points, because I don't think we talk about the points within the application period, but clearly spelling that out. So if we do come to the grid and that application is really scored poorly because of how the grant writer possibly wrote it, it does not speak to the quality of the program, we're going to look at the reporting. But again, they're not going to have the green light, because I agree with what Ron said, but that is going to be a set criterion that's communicated up front, even on paper, that people can read that. And so when we come to the meetings, we are going to emphasize that, but they've already been told beforehand.
So sort of something in the RFI that spells that out more, I would say, is what you're looking for, maybe, that explains it if you're a current grantee applying for continuation funding, that, you know. Oh, sorry. This thing is so... I can't get my knee on me and tilt this way. So that you can make it clear up front that we are going to have some kind of a process for looking at your past performance and using that in the recommendation process. Because I would say that staff did include that, and for all current grantees, we gave you the pertinent information in your memo about the past performance. You know, have people done what they said they were going to do, et cetera, et cetera. So, and if there were any specific issues, let you know what those issues were. So that did in fact factor into it, but not at the review. I mean, the one thing about points that you have to be careful of, that those are reviewers. You're not awarding the points. The reviewers are. And the reviewers are not in the best position to be evaluating past performance. They haven't been working with these people for this. So they're not the people who I would probably choose to give that evaluation to. I'd probably prefer to have staff make recommendations to you all, and you have familiarity with these people. Many of you have been here for longer, as well as us who are working with them on a more day-to-day basis. So that maybe we need to make it more clear in the RFI, perhaps, rather than assigning points per se to it.
Yeah, that's a good point about the points, because I forgot it's the reviewers who
Yeah,
really
they're
assign those
awarding the
points.
points, and that.
Unless we reserved, a certain amount of points to staff on that for that criterion, but I guess I'm
That's
hearing.
possible. You could do that.
Yeah, that's-
You could rework.
I mean, that could, although, your memo...
But remember, people who aren't current grantees wouldn't be eligible for those points. So you just have to think about that.
Right, it would show
that
the
would-
bias, but then I think actually that it wouldn't, in some ways, if you did that, then the example that you used in here was Peninsula Children's Center. Deborah, I know is here. That scored significantly low. So if you were to give 3 points or 5 points or whatever to bump up ones that had good past reports and performance, it still wouldn't have bumped that up very much. And people would say, well, you already gave them a bias. So I actually think that would tie our hands more. I thought the information that you gave us really helped us say, this group, even though it scored 3 points lower than this group or 20 points lower than this group, are doing a great job, and we should continue funding it. So I like the system that was there. The only way I would tweak it is to make sure that's more clear before people even apply.
Mm-hmm. The only devil's advocate thing I'll put into this is that I think you could be open to criticism that even though you might allow organizations that we have currently funded who are not writing particular applications to continue being funded because of those considerations you all just put on the table, that still puts small and less known organizations at a very significant disadvantage if they don't write good applications, because they don't have the benefit of being able to show you that they can perform well, like somebody else who might have written a not very good application does. So for new applicants. So what I'm saying is that a system like that you're talking about does heavily weight against someone who does not write a very good application and is new.
You're right.
And they might be just as good a performer. So that's the one thing, is that you kind of close yourself off to that.
The TA, because I think there are other ways that we can get at that. The TA,
You think TA might be
technical assistance for grant writing, because you're right. The new applicants who aren't running on their track record with you, we more heavily weight the score on their proposal, because what else do we have to go by?
Mm-hmm.
And so
you think TA might be a
the technical
mechanism to
assistance, I think,
fix
would
that?
help a lot.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because right now, what type of technical assistance is given to?
There's nothing formal. We have not hired anybody to give technical. People call us and we try to help them out. But
Session, a training?
we did bidders conferences where people could come and ask questions, but not really training, and not individualized consultation. And I think it can be. I mean, the reason we haven't is because it's expensive, of course. That's why. But I think it might well be worth it on the quality bump up. And it might be worth it to address this issue that you're talking about. of not disadvantaging smaller organizations who are new to quite the same degree as this would otherwise handicap.
So all the input that we're giving you now is going to be presented at the next meeting so that the public can have input on it? We're not deciding anything?
No,
at this
you are not.
meeting?
You are not deciding anything at all. The whole concept was to understand what do people think about what we should do, and then the
Yeah,
idea.
I think this is really a debrief, and we're not acting on any RFI related.
No, there's no RFI
recommendations.
on the table.
What we will hopefully act on is leverage fund guidelines. We'll talk about that today, and hopefully have something to decide upon at our next meeting.
You probably not
Correct.
decide next meeting, probably take input
Okay,
and then
take
decide
input.
on the third meeting.
Okay.
The concept with this was to really come up with recommendations that we would give whoever is going to be down the line the benefit of your wisdom right after you went through the process. I didn't want to wait for another 5 years because people forget and people leave. So that's really where this is heading, is to develop a set of recommendations. So yes, we would also like to get from people who've gone through this and make it clear that their comments are welcome at the next meeting to give the kind of input on the funding process. So you all have your input, but we're going to hear theirs, and you may want to. Then staff wants to take all of that in consideration before we write recommendations for you all to consider.
So the other thing kind of related to that is just making sure that at the very top, which I think you did on the last round, based on our feedback, above the score number, it says reviewers score a proposal, to be very specific that that's what that number means. So people understand that's what that is.
Okay.
Because I think people still went into it thinking, this is my score, it's really high. This is, my organization, my program is scored the highest. Why aren't I being funded?
Mm-hmm.
It's the reviewer's score of the proposal.
Mm-hmm.
Which is just one thing that the allocation committee needs to look at.
And just putting that right along the top of the column, I think, helps reiterate that.
Yeah, it's in the RFI, but it could be made. I mean, we deliberately said that this time, so at least we hope that we put people on notice for that. And I do think that people understood that better this time around. But I think it could be highlighted. There's always more you can do in that regard.
So what about embedded in it? Yeah, I was just going to say, what about sort of the perception familiar organizations or better known organizations do better than less known organizations? Perhaps even all other things being equal, scoring similar, having maybe not the track record with us, but sort of having.
I'm not so sure that that's true. I think over, I don't know how many sessions I've been a part of this now, but I mean we funded stuff that none of us had ever heard of, but we liked the idea and we looked at it and listened to it, and I don't think it had as much to do with familiarity as it did was, wow, it's a good idea, it's a big bang for the buck, it's covering a lot of kids, and let's give it a try. As opposed to, well, it's a new name, it's a good name, so let's just take it.
I think another issue, it's not necessarily big, small, more so than enrichment program versus full service program. I think sometimes the enrichment programs felt that there was a big shift to go to full service programs where, we did even at the end allocate some funds that were specified to go to the enrichment programs, but we had left over and then put it over to the full service. So I think, in a sense, that's where a bigger issue is at, and how we address that. Because I think sometimes with the enrichment programs, they feel their programs are just as valuable, and even though it's not full service, how does one even grow to be full service if we continue to get less funding than those full service programs?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I guess it depends also whether you mean across all funding areas, because that was only in one funding area, that issue, and what you're talking about could theoretically apply to any funding area. And also, I think probably the most the thing that's hard, but when you say that, because my first thought when you say that is when I look at the rounds where we had lots of current grantees, which would be everything but foster care, I would say that really what was waiting there was not what you're talking about so much. It's about being a current grantee and performing well. So that I think was probably the biggest decider. I mean, if I look at the numbers, that's kind of what gets borne out there. That's who we actually funded, and it's because there weren't a lot of good reasons not to fund them. Frankly, they often scored well again, and they're doing a good job, right? But in I think it's more instructive to look at that in a new area like foster care. Was that really true in foster care? Did we really fund sort of well-known versus lesser well-known, or larger versus smaller? And we didn't really do that analysis. I'd have to just give you an off-the-cuff. I mean, I don't know, what would be your sense?
Well, we really went based on the scores in foster care. There were 2 programs that were either passed or current grantees at the time that had been funded in either leverage fund or child abuse prevention intervention. So those two, rose to the top. And then from there, I really believe it was in score order until we ran out of funding, and then went down to the next. Volunteers of America had a program that was quite expensive, and there wasn't enough money, even though they would have scored next in line, and then went to the next program there. And it was based on score. So whether that's well-known organizations are scoring higher than less well-known organizations, I don't know. I would need to look at the list again, too.
Refresh your memory. I mean, I do think that small organizations have, I don't think that well-known, not well-known is maybe dispositive so much as size. I just think capacity is a big player here. And smaller organizations are at a disadvantage because of the great level of accountability in the application writing and, I mean, everything all taken together. It's pretty high demand compared to like small foundation funders or something. So that to me is a disadvantage that is built in. It's tougher from government, I think, to do that. And also with 5% admin cap, you don't want to be giving out really small grants to try people out as much because it's administratively expensive to do that.
So well, maybe this question should come up later. But I guess at some point I want to pose the question to staff. A lot of the proposals we ratcheted down the funding we awarded versus what was requested. And I guess, I'm curious how that went in terms of, effectively getting what was the essence of what was proposed in the proposal, but for far less dollars. I mean, did we maintain sort of fidelity? I think that was the word. One of our previous allocation committee.
Well, I think it's kind of some of that is spoken to in the fact that 95% of the people asked for expansion, so they want to serve more children, or in some cases provide additional service components. And so I think that really accounts for why the number, like what they requested, was so much higher in many cases than what they actually got. So what happens then is when they reform. I mean, this is the other piece of it with not doing the two-step. And and everybody asked for expansion. That's why I would be interested, because people spent so much time constructing budgets and program models for more people and more places and doing work. And then, say, for instance, if you want to serve more schools, going out to those schools and getting their buy-in and all this kind of work that they did. And yet, if we're just going to fund them at the current level, so what happens to decrease?
Maybe that's a question that I should ask more for the foster care area, since that was all new.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So
okay,
for the rest, we just kept them to
one
current.
number, and then we actually awarded maybe half of what they requested.
So then what happened is they needed to come back with, a new scope of work based on the amount of funding that they were awarded. So in many cases, it meant that they're serving fewer kids. Other cases, it meant that they reduced the number of service components that they're going to be offering for the children that they're serving. So they're working with what they were awarded. And, we don't have track record to be able to say, well, we weren't reducing current level funding, so it's hard to know how that impacted, other than it changed what they're able to deliver to start with. But nobody said. But nobody said it's not.
They were able to adapt with diminished maybe expectation of what they were going to get. And
right.
Still come through with a program that addresses helping children in foster care succeed.
Right. No one
in
said,
essence, with their proposal, in accordance with their proposal.
No one said that's too little funding to be able to do anything. That was, we said if this amount of, we recognize this amount of funding is significantly less than what you requested. So, of course, have the option to say, I'm sorry, we can't accept those funds because we don't feel like we can institute our model. That didn't occur. People worked with what they had and made adjustments to the primarily numbers that they were able to serve.
Okay.
I think that the same message should go out to the current grantees as the new applicants, that there's really limited amount of new money at the table, and so it's unlikely. But the thing is, if they don't ask for it, we can't give them more than they ask for. So They have to put in that extra work. I understand completely what you're saying, especially in terms of getting agreements from schools. If you're going to, expand the SUN program to new schools, that's a lot of work involved. It's not just doubling the number of students in the same delivery area.
Or even more so for enrichment programs. I mean, who want to go there,
Right.
often hitting higher
right.
numbers. I mean, it just, I don't want to completely discount the amount of work it takes, and also the amount of work it takes for all of you to evaluate
So I
it all.
think that if they know that up front, that there's not, they know to temper how much they're looking to expand. They may want to ask for some expansion dollars and hope they're going to get it, but be aware that they could go through that work. I mean, that's true with any proposal you put in. It's true with any business plan. It may pan out. It may not. I don't know how to avoid that,
Okay.
other than putting a strong message up front.
Okay. Well, there's definitely some concrete ideas about kind of the direction you're interested in heading, and I'll be curious to hear what the public has to say about this issue.
But I think on the technical assistance,
okay.
it was lower up.
Yeah.
But just to say that for new groups applying, I like the idea. It's not fully fleshed out here about how that would happen. But in general, I like the idea of having some technical assistance for groups on their grant writing. I do think that if they're lower capacity and they're at a disadvantage for that, that's the way we weed out groups. We have large-size grants, and we need to be able to fund groups that have the capacity to do the work. If they're really small groups, they may want to come under the umbrella of a larger group. They may want to do some collaboration. So there's, but I don't think that we should be stretching to try to fund every group that has such low capacity. That might fall in the area of a leverage fund. If, for instance, there's some particular target group where there is no organization that currently has the capacity to meet a need in the community, that might be the area that a leverage fund would come together and look, some of the private funders might come in and really look at how can they do capacity building, but we can't do all of that ourselves.
Okay.
I think just one issue when doing the technical assistance, I have talked to some foundations, and sometimes the applications that they receive, they're done by consultants for the nonprofit organization, and that consultant is just not good. So I think a part of that technical assistance is how do you select a good grant writer? Mm-hmm. And that could be one big issue. They may have the capacity, but if they think they're getting a really good grant writer and the ultimate outcome is that they're not, then that obviously challenges the success that they're going to have. Not that that we're discussing that right now, but I just want to bring that up.
Okay, so that seems sort of maybe how you might be interested in tackling that issue, is instead looking at technical assistance to help with newer and smaller groups, rather than changing the structure for how we ask people to compete. So I don't want to necessarily curtail discussion, but I do know if we're trying to keep more or less on calendar and have time for leverage fund, we have other things to talk about, so I think we probably ought to move
Why don't
on.
we move on to the administrative rates?
Yeah, admin rates. I know there's probably a number of things to talk about with here, but let me give a quick sketch of sort of one of the issues that staff noticed, and there may be other issues you want to talk about with regard to admin rates. But in the just to recall, we came under a lot of criticism for not allowing people to recover their full administrative costs. So in the interests of trying to allow people to recover what their true and full administrative costs were up to a certain point, up to 15%, we made that change. And in the RFI, we highlighted to people, okay, it can't be more than 15%, and you need to substantiate the actual costs and give us an allocation method for how you figure out, for instance, that your administrative FTE space costs this much. Tell us how you figured that out. So that's as far as we went. We didn't really discuss or ask them to do anything else about admin rates or admin costs in the RFI. When it came time to give you recommended funding amounts for groups, people were all over the map in what they requested for administrative rates, and they did not necessarily correspond to what they had previously requested, didn't correspond to what they had in their financial statements regarding their functional expenses. There was not a relationship that we could discern as staff across the board that we could use a rule to kind of come up with an admin rate to use in making our recommendations to you all for what to fund. So on the back end, that's how that came in with the concept of we'll try to get to what the actual rate really is, right? We're trying to help people recover their full cost right? That was the concept. We'll try to figure out what the real rate is. So that's what we proceeded to do on the back end by using people's financial statements, audits if they had them, if not 990s, to figure out what their actual administrative rate is. I think we need to make it, or we need to at least discuss which direction do we want to head, because the RFI really went in one direction. Tell us, it can't be more than 15, make sure your expenses are not prohibited by us, so things we don't pay for, and tell us how you got to the numbers you got to, okay? Versus, let's figure out what your real rate is. What is your agency rate for, or this program rate, if it differs from the agency rate, for admin expenses, and we'll reimburse you at that level. Those are really two different
Can I ask
directions.
a question
Yeah.
there? When you had to negotiate, did you just end up using the 990 rate?
Well, we
what
used
they
the
last year?
audit most typically because most people had audits. If they didn't have an audit or they were in the process of preparing, or in some cases when their audit, they had 990s that were updated what their last audit was, then we were willing to look at what the most recent information was. So yes, we went deep into the financial statements when we negotiated the contracts.
But I think Alyssa's question, is that where you ultimately ended up with
Yeah, is that
most
where you-
admin rates? Is
Well,
relying on the audit or the 990?
it depended on the
As
circumstances.
opposed to what was proposed.
How often did it vary? Did you
Oh, it
use that
varied.
at 90%
The
of it?
applications didn't have anything to do with that.
Right. And
But
since
what you negotiated, did it 90% of it end up on the rate that they could show had been in their audit or their 990?
90%? No, probably not.
what the
Lower than
percentage
that.
is.
Because there's a lot of things that. Well, first of all, did anybody get the article I sent around today?
Yeah.
Okay. There are plenty of people who don't log those rates correctly. Okay, so if it's 4%, and I know darn well that program cannot be delivered on 4%, period. I don't care what it says in your financial statements. No, I'm not going to make them do 4% because that's stupid. So, the point was we tried to make to people was what's in your financial statements should actually reflect what your functional expenses really are, so we don't run into this cognitive dissonance here. So in some cases they went up because of that. In some cases the program was different than the agency, and people could demonstrate that. We have programs that run at 3%. We have programs that run at 10%. Depends on what we're doing, for larger agencies with many programs. So there were different reasons why it might vary, but it varied. That was the starting point for the discussion, and we went from there.
I still had struggled with that we went to 15% just from thinking back where we started, and we held people in most cases at 5%, and there were some exceptions going up. But to take a $1 million program, and again, it's taxpayer money, and they operated this program serving 75 kids, let's just say, I'm just kind of recalling this a little bit, they were able to get an extra $100,000 to go to admin, even though they hadn't had that extra $100,000 over the last 5 years. And
It doesn't mean they're not spending it, though. It just means someone else is paying for it.
Right. And that's what I'm saying. It is a tax levy. We were able to get 75 kids a year served for the $1 million, and now we're still having 75 kids served, and it's $1,100,000. So the taxpayer footed the extra $100,000 and didn't get any more kids served for being able to do that.
But you get other advantages.
Yeah, I would say, is that a good use of taxpayer money? That's what you're questioning, which
Yes.
is the right question to ask. But I think that there's a lot of research that shows that typically in the philanthropy world, we have underfunded administrative overhead, which has really hampered the success of delivery of services. Because, overhead doesn't sound like a sexy term, or administrative cost recovery, but it goes to fundraising, which can help organizations make the case for why they need to be funded. It goes to monitoring and evaluation and capturing lessons learned. It goes to networking with other groups. It goes to the receptionist that's the frontline person that's greeting people out there. It goes to rent, which, in some cases is more important in some organizations than others. I know one of the ones that had a higher rent that we had discussed at one point was the Native American Youth Association. Because they have such a small percentage of the population, 1% in Portland, there's a very small number of kids at any of these different schools that are Native American, and so the need that they have for a place to gather is greater perhaps than other ethnic groups. So there's a whole lot of variety in administrative overhead. There's board training. We want boards to be diverse. We want them to have good management skills. So we're asking a lot of them. and yet we're not willing to pay. And I remember the rate that you said was the average when you went back and looked at the 990 for all of our grantees was 10.9, and yet we had capped it at 5, 8, or 10%, which meant we were systematically underfunding the overhead of these organizations. So, management information systems, you think about in the business world, all of the money that goes to overhead. So the whole world of philanthropy has now moved toward two things. One is trying to figure out what the real cost of recovery is for administrative overhead and not undercutting that, because that doesn't lead to strong, sustainable organizations. And I actually brought a whole bunch of articles here that if we had time, I would quote from. One is a call to action, organizing to increase effectiveness and impact on foundation grant making by National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. Another one is Nonprofit Overhead Cost Project by the Center of Nonprofits and Philanthropy.
I think that was the article Lisa sent out this morning. So it was about that project, wasn't it?
No, it was the one I sent this morning was about just basically that focusing so much energy on the functional expenses of nonprofits is a waste of time, because the stress that people are undergoing to lower that number leads to incorrect classification half the time anyway. And so when you're looking at those numbers, you're likely misleading yourself anyway.
Right.
And so that was the argument that I was wanting to put in front of you, that perhaps, when I look at the two ways we might look at this issue, one of which is to try to get to what the real rate really is by looking at people's functional expenses, perhaps is maybe not a wise use of anyone's time.
Well, because we also had a couple of organizations who, I think they were big enough and they were efficient enough that you could pour extra money to them and not be at the same they didn't need the same admin rate,
right.
And so they told us, no, we don't need any more for admin. We can live within the 5 or 6%.
And again, there's a huge variety that you can't always tell by an organizational budget size. Some of these groups are local branches of national organizations that come in and have a tremendous amount of marketing materials and branding and things like that. So, that's why I think we were trying to get away with a very specific amount tied to a budget. I think that was the right move. We didn't anticipate the issues that came up. And I remember reading the proposals, looking at, wait, this admin is 11%, but we're doing up to 15%. Why are we doing that? But we kind of realized that during the process. And I thought, well, we're not necessarily trying to fund more than their administrative rate, but already, because you were using a calculation of current plus COLA plus up to 15%, we just used 15%. And it was hard halfway through the process to start renegotiating all of those.
I think you would have to make it clear on the upfront that to people in their applications, you need to ask for the rate that you want. And that's the rate that we will make your award based on. You don't get to change it later unless we decide for some reason it's unreasonable, or there's things in there that are not justified, in which case it would have to be lower.
And I think you came up with a good recommendation that it mirror the percent of management and general expenses shown on the most recent audit, or 990, or they provide detailed justification for a rate that substantially differs from their management and general rate. There may be cases where they say, well, we were really under because we just couldn't do any fundraising last year, and we were not able to keep up with our infrastructure needs. They may make a case for that, but I think that it should be, the general understanding should be, it should be what's on the 990 or what their real rate is from last year, and unless there's some that they can justify an exception.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's two ways to go there. You could say it needs to be the real rate, but then we run into all the problems we just outlined, okay? Because how do we determine what the real rate is? Complicated, time-consuming, doesn't not reflected by the financial statements a lot of times.
But she's saying you start with, what's in the 990 or their audit.
And ask for a justification for anything that differs from your program.
And what I'm saying is that probably will not avoid the issues that we'll be in the same place. We'll just be doing it a little bit more in advance if we do it at RFI, versus doing it up to 15. Doesn't really, not so much focusing on the rate, justify the expenses, make sure that none of the prohibited expenses, and the rate turns out to be whatever it turns out to be against program expenses, so long as it's not more than 15. Do you see the difference? So one,
not sure why one is more complicated than the other.
Because in one situation, you're trying to arrive at what the real rate is. Okay, and that's why I sent the article out today, because it talks about how difficult that is. It is focused on the wrong issue, and that it takes I can verify this much. It takes a lot of time, and I'm not sure that we'll get good answers in the RFI. Frankly, I think that we would probably end up doing the same thing we're doing now, is going back and negotiating individually, getting additional paperwork, doing the whole shebang like we just did. So it will make it difficult to recommend funding amounts at the outset if you're not satisfied with with what they put in the application.
So are you saying within the budget that they can apply some of their expenses to that overhead? 15%? Because I'm not kind of following that other option.
The other option would be, okay, you have your administrative expense category. These are the expenses, the types of things we do pay for. Here's what we don't pay for. Don't list anything we don't pay for. You can charge up to 15% of program costs, and that's your ceiling. Charges for the administrative expenses that are actually related to this program, and list out how you came to those numbers. Okay, so if you're charging me $1,000 for administrative personnel space, explain to me how you got that number. That would be the extent of it. Okay, whatever the percent came to be would not be tested against something else. It would just be the percent, as long as it's under 15 or under, of program costs. Do you see the difference in how we would have to go about, and so they would put that in their application, assuming we might X out expense Y and expense Z because that we don't cover those, or that calculation was wrong, or something like that. We might have quibbles like that, but we would not be arguing about what is your true rate. Do you understand the difference? So that's where I was wanting. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I'm not going to put Dan on the spot, but if he's going to bid something out for the city, and he wants to get the most efficient bid for environmental services, and somebody can do it for 5% less admin, that group's going to get a better look, and it's going to use tax money more efficiently because they can do it more efficiently.
But it doesn't work.
It seems like that should figure into our scheme here. If there's a grantee that has an organization that's efficient and it can add capacity cheaper without loading the same admin costs, then we should reward them for that.
But it just doesn't work that way. It's not like you're buying widgets. And so we can say, okay, I need 500 widgets. There are 3 corporations that can give me 500 widgets. This one can do it for this much, this one can do it for that much, that one can do it for that much. And I'm picking the lowest cost and the one with the lowest overhead. Or whatever. I'm picking the lowest cost, and however they got there, I don't really care. Okay? We're not buying widgets. We're not buying any of the same things. We're buying a whole bunch of different things. And so they're not comparable. So if you were buying things only based on the admin rate, then we would simply say, we would order our list differently. We would pick the people with the lowest admin rates.
No, I'm saying it's something to consider, though.
But they don't necessarily list. But you're saying that the amount of the admin rate that they're putting in their application reflects their efficiency. What I'm saying is that's not correct. What people put in an application might be might be more related to their other fundraising capacity. Okay, they might be great fundraisers, and they put all their private money into their admin. They don't ask any admin from us. Does that mean they're more efficient, or that they run at a lower level of overhead? No, it doesn't. It just means we're not paying for it. So you're not getting an answer to that question.
I think, in using Ron's example, though, I mean, the city does procure services as much as it procures widgets. So, I think it would be worth looking at how some of the bureaus, large bureaus that do procure a lot of services, look at admin rates. I mean, there's a certain art about that, and you could have a company that really wants the Portland contract and may show a lower admin rate in order to get that job.
But you're asking for them
it's
to respond to an RFP on one specific set of services or products. Yes. And in our case, in some cases we have people going out and reaching really the hardest to reach at-risk kids, and others are doing enrichment programs where maybe the kids aren't quite as hard off, and there are more kids at that school, so it's easier to reach with one particular person. I mean, it really is apples to oranges. The other thing that I would argue is that when you undercut the administrative rate, you lose a lot of efficiency. You have tremendous turnover. Another thing administrative overhead would go to is making sure that you have an adequate human resources section. And so there's tremendous amount of waste in nonprofits that are going, because policies aren't put in place, they're going over and over and over the same kind of issue that comes up every year. They're not capturing the lessons learned. They're not putting into policy. They're understaffed. They're putting every person they can out on the front lines delivering services to kids, but the services may not be as good. Tremendous turnover. So in my view, often a higher administrative over rate means a stronger infrastructure, which means a more efficient organization. And that's the kind of twist that I think the philanthropy world is starting to move toward, and it is counterintuitive in some ways. And again, you're asking the exact right questions, but I think that the response is taxpayers are getting more money, better service out of their dollars when we are providing the kind of infrastructure that nonprofits really need to operate at optimal efficiency. And I would be happy to send a lot of these links to articles because there's a lot of research behind this. There's research that actually compares when you fund an organization at this rate of overhead and then you increase their overhead to this, what's the ultimate impact on their direct services? And it shows that there's a sweet spot. They call it a sweet spot. You don't want to go too high and have a lot of waste. But what we've tended to do is way undercut it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in taking a look at this. And this is a great discussion. I'm not sure we have the luxury as a publicly funded entity to maybe go the way some foundations are going the way the professional literature seems to say we should be going. I mean, as much as I think the article you sent us this morning about, just do away with admin rates altogether, I don't see how as a public body we could, in good faith, do that without others leading the trail, others blazing the trail way in advance of us on those issues.
Yeah. No, I'm not suggesting that we forget the
I thought
concept
we did
or
a good
a
compromise
ceiling.
by saying up to 15% because that's what the county does. That's what there are a lot of different organizations do that. I certainly don't think we're going overboard in doing that. But I think that this will be a great one to get input from the people actually doing the applications to say, would you like to try to have a section in the budget where you say what your administrative overhead is and you justify it? I would certainly be open to that. I would say you could offer two different options, the 990, you point to what you've published in the past, or you give us justification. And then I think you as staff looking through it can make the same kind of recommendations that you did to us on program services. We think this organization could provide fewer or greater, or what, you gave a lot of recommendations so that if you look at the administrative overhead and say 12% seems to be very reasonable here, that you're the first one that gives us a staff recommendation on how much to fund. And you can say, or I think that they could do with less administrative overhead, and so we'd recommend this amount. I mean, you did that all the time. You recommended
Well, we recommended funding amounts. We didn't recommend admin amounts, and I don't know that we should get into that business, frankly, because I think you have to have an objective.
You're doing it
well,
now.
You have to have an objective basis, and we did start the same place. I'm saying we just went through this process of using the 990 financial forms as the starting point. All I can say is that it was still a tremendous amount of work to get to an end point, because in some cases, people's rates in their financial statements did actually relate to the rate that for their agency and their program. Right. In some cases, they were directly translatable. There was very little problem. But in most cases, that was not the case for one reason and another. And so that's the piece where I don't know that on the face of applications we're going to be able to make that kind of recommendation to you. So I'd be curious, maybe the answer is to try to hear some public input, because I actually think of them as, it's not an either or, it's usually a one or the other. Either we're going to look at rates, we're going to try to determine what somebody's actual rate is, as close as we can, for this program, versus we'll give you a ceiling and then you need to justify your expenses. And then that's it. There's not a determination of your rate except for that. Does that make sense? There's really two different methods by which you would do it. And I think we kind of used one method in the RFI here and we went to a different method on the back end. And I don't think that was a good way to go. I think it's one or the other. We should do it on the front end. Decide which one you want to use and keep it that way, and rather than kind of doing both, which I think
I definitely
didn't really
think
work.
Should be up on the front end, but I don't know that you're going to escape the place where you are now, which is having to use some judgment.
Well, it's not that I object to using
none of us
judgment.
agree.
Yeah, no, it's not that. It's just that because of this issue of the distance between what's in financial statements and what people's real rates are, that creates a very large judgment range, shall we say,
Right.
which I don't know is the best way to go. So that was my main point of making that. All right. Well, I think we've got some input from you all. I think it would also be helpful to hear what the folks have to say at the next meeting about that.
Right.
So we are at a couple minutes past 2. We have until 3 o'clock. We do want to leave time for the leverage fund. Which of these other things we kind of hit technical assistance already. So meeting format and sort of, you had cultural comp things on the RFI you raised as well.
Yes, for the
Alyssa.
small.
Okay. Do you want to hit both of those now?
Which one? Meeting format? Take it in order? Okay, I'll say one thing about the meeting format. This is for the allocation meeting. I felt like we would often, the five of us would agree on something, and then we had more discussion around where several of us agreed and several disagreed. And I may not have chosen to fund something, and then when it did get funded, because perhaps 3 or 4 people wanted it to be funded, I would have rather have gone back and lowered my amount for something above instead of, I just felt like the ones at the end were really disadvantaged. So one idea I had that might address that is to say that each organization has a draft starting point with the lowest amount that any one of us suggest. And if it's 0, then, they're probably not going to be considered. But if I said 100,000 and the rest of you said 125, 130,000, then the starting place is 100,000, and we go through and discuss each of them and then go back and decide where to add, because it was very uncomfortable to have decided a higher amount for a group, then get to the bottom and realize there wasn't enough, and then go back up and try to peel away money. So I just feel like it's better to start with a lower amount and then add to that.
Sounds like the legislature.
Is that how they work?
At the end.
Starting,
So I'm trying to, with that, I'm trying to get away from...
So you would do a recommended funding amount, and what we would do is we would start with
the agreed upon minimum.
The preliminary decision would be whatever the lowest number that somebody recommended was, I guess.
Go through and discuss them all, because then you realize that some have a lot more merit than maybe you had given it, because you hear other people's arguments. You might in your mind think, all right, I'm willing to go a little higher on that than I originally was. But what I'm trying to get away from is peeling money away from groups that we had already decided. That was very uncomfortable and unfair to the groups, I thought. And also trying to get away from really disadvantaging the ones that were at the end.
I guess,
does that make sense to you?
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I guess I'm not comfortable with the idea that one member can, and this happened, can put in a 0 for a program, because usually that means he or she maybe has some very strong issues, either with the organization or with the program proposed, and that sort of becomes the lowest common denominator under which a decision gets made.
But the thing is, if that...
Well,
the one member
that
0.
out.
I think, wait a second. I think if we're going to start from points of agreement, though...
no, it would be at 0, but taking that example, if
you
I
start
were the
at
one
0?
that said 0...
If one person, she's saying if one of 5 of us zeroed a program and the other had money there, then 0 becomes the starting point for that organization.
Just the starting point. But then we discuss anything that has any numbers. If they're all 0, then obviously those probably don't get discussed unless there's a very eloquent plea at the end. But for instance, if I said 0, then and you guys all argued and it became quite apparent that I was going to get more, then I might want to give less to one of the groups that I originally put out a higher number, because when I put out my numbers, I was counting 0 for this, which meant I had more for all the other groups. Now all of a sudden we're diverting some money from there, and so I have to take it off somewhere. Instead of only being able to take it off from the ones in the bottom, because we've already approved the ones at the top, that doesn't seem like a fair way to do it. So the groups that have the biggest advantage are the ones that all 5 of us agree on right off the start. They're like, that's done. Okay, we all 5 agree, it's done. They get this much. You all 5 agree, get this much. Then there might be a huge amount of debate, because one person might be the odd person out, but you can't take it from on top because we've already agreed, so you have to take it from the ones below. So typically we funded a lot fewer dollars for the ones that were at the bottom. So that was just one way to try. I think it could be interesting to try to play it out, like have a little...
Yeah, I understand your problem statement
group.
exactly. I'm not sure. Like I said, I'm just not sure that's where I see the solution. But I understand exactly what you're identifying.
I'd have to play it out in my mind, because I'm feeling like, because then if they start at 0, but then do you move on and leave them at 0, and then it still seems like you're going to end up having to come back and
You'll have to come back.
Adjust people. You're saying you want to only have to adjust up. You don't ever want to have to adjust anybody down. But if you run into that same scenario where somebody you gave 0 to, okay, you come up from 0. And so other people maybe come down from whatever they said, but you're still going to be put in the position of having to take money off of other things that you gave money to. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? So I'm not sure it cures your problem.
No, you wouldn't take money off. You would
have to take money personally off, because you would still end up, if you ended up voting for higher than your 0, preliminary wise, because the other 4 people persuaded you to do that, then in your own calculations, you're going to have
come down.
to come down, and other ones too. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I don't know that you get away from that problem in the end.
Put that as a challenge to the public out there. Help us come up with
Yeah, no, I think it's, like I said, I understand exactly the problem you're identifying. And I guess maybe another approach we might want to consider, and I'm not sure how this would all work out, but if we had sort of each category of funding a contingency amount that we sort of hold in reserve until we kind of get to this point where there's all 5 of us or 4 of us strongly in agreement, but we
an
may
interesting idea.
That is
have
an
exhausted
interesting
the
idea.
funding
Good idea.
previously. So maybe the awards all 5 of us agree on are at the, we'll say, 95% amount of what's requested until we're through, until we get down there and deal with it.
Yeah.
So get that one up there, contingency amount. Okay, and maybe make a note on there so that's unallocated at the beginning, used up at the end, just so I remember what that is. Try to play it out. We'll practice a little with some of the ideas you give and see if we think it works.
Any other thoughts on the format of the allocation? I think the issue that we need to make clear to people that it's not just scores. I think we tried, but oftentimes...
I think we could do a better job at making, which I kind of wrote in there. I don't really necessarily want to say it all over again, but I think we do a better job of explaining how you all, I think you kind of did it informally at the beginning. I think we need to formalize that about how you arrived at your slates and how, And I think maybe, just to make it clear that what we ended up doing, although I don't know that it was so clear for people to see, was proceeding through areas of agreement in order of score. So, I think that wasn't always clear for people. So in other words, you might have been the top scoring application, but you didn't get discussed because not all 5 people agreed on you because they decided they wanted to do something else that was down there. You know what I'm saying? So that gets opaque for people. I think that, although I think it might be more clear if we gave our staff recommendations up front, which was the other thing we talked about doing that at the beginning, having you all discuss your process and then giving our recommendations up front. So that way at least it would be clear kind of where we don't want to take the time to do it because these meetings are so lengthy anyway. That was kind of our reason for not, but I don't know if maybe we should.
Anything else on, when we talked about technical assistance, I think we've covered everything.
Okay.
One of the things that I really appreciated that some groups did on this table was living with disability or the disabled. A few groups added that to you have a racial ethnic diversity table and a gender. And, I couldn't get a good grasp on how many groups were working with children with disabilities. It's one of the things that we said we were interested in. And some said we do a really good job of that, and yet there was no statistics in their proposal about how many people they've actually served with disabilities. So I thought that would be a good thing to add to the table. And then another thing on this particular one, also put below 185% of federal poverty. And I thought, that's good to know what kind of income level. It's not just about ethnicity, it's about income level as well. So I suggest that we add those. And also, is it clear to them that this is based on their current programming as opposed to their proposed?
If it is a current program, it is supposed to be.
Yeah,
If it's
okay.
going to be a brand new program, then they can't. So.
Anything else before we move on to leverage fund? Okay. And let's go to the leverage fund. So you want to
I'm going to give it just a
set the stage?
Yeah, I'll set the
Okay.
stage, give you a brief outline here of kind of how we did it. Mostly also just because you guys, 2 people were here, 2 people were not here when we did it before. So when this was set up the first time around, again, $3 million set aside for it. And what we did there was
Microphone.
I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Can you not? Okay, sorry. It feels like I'm in there, but not quite. It's too cold to uncross my legs. This room is always freezing. So what we did the first time around in trying to figure out how to invest this $3 million, and again, the concept was to garner additional investment in the areas where we invest money in the community. And to do that, the first time around, we hired someone from the Metropolitan Group to begin to go out and make contacts with funders to sort of talk up what this concept was and saying, hey, you can amplify your investments. If you invest in our funding areas, you can maybe get double the money invested in this program that you might be interested in funding. So the concept was that the contacts about the qualifying projects were supposed to come from other funders to us. So this person went out and did outreach. The idea was that other funders, foundations, et cetera, would call us and say, hey, I've got a project that we're interested in. It's thus and such. We think it might fit. What do you think? Would you like to kind of come along? So then the idea was if staff talked with the other foundation funder about a project and it looked promising, we would go to the applying organization and request certain information from them, a sort of truncated summary of their program, to make sure it met kind of with our basic specs. We then would looking at all this information, would decide whether we thought it was qualifying, and we would come to the committee then and recommend whether we go forward with this or not. Meanwhile, the other funder would often be proceeding on a similar track. Sometimes their decision would come in before ours, depending on timing. So they would already voted to fund X, and then we would be coming to say, do we agree to fund double X, essentially. That's kind of how the process went. The minimum grant that we gave under that category was $250,000. Could be over a period of years, but it had to be at least that much. And it required a 1-to-1 match. So the private foundation was putting in as much as we were putting in.
And could it only
At least
be
a
one
1-to-1.
foundation? Or
No, it could
multiple?
be two. It could be multiple sources. And in some cases, it was a foundation and an individual grant, donor. Different things. So that was sort of the main way that it got used and the main sort of thrust of the leverage fund. We also wanted to try to provide a source for local matching funds because some national grants or national foundations, sort of really when I say that I mean East Coast foundations in particular, and the federal government will sometimes require local matching funds. So we wanted to kind of try to be a pool for that, and so we had certain rules about how you might use us as a pool for that. We had to get a copy of your grant application. It had to be at least 2-to-1 match because most of the times local match requirements were lower than the amount that they would give you. That was a pretty typical scenario for federal grants.
2-to-1 in which direction?
In other words, they're giving twice as much money as we're giving. So often local match, it would be 10%, 5%. It would not be a huge amount of money. I mean, that's the typical scenario, which is why we set it at that. So those were kind of the parameters. They were written up and they were published. That's what's in the back of your packet there. They were published. They were on our website. And they were given out to private funders as well. What happened implementation-wise after we kind of came up with this process was that I would say overall sort of foundation response, in the sense of getting contacts from foundations was pretty lukewarm. We didn't really get a lot of contacts that were actually generated by the foundation, despite doing the outreach and paying for the consultation to kind of go out there and do that with them. Instead, what would typically happen is that the person who was applying for money from a private foundation would contact me or someone else at the fund and say, hey, I'm putting out an application and we'd really love to get CHIF to leverage that. How can I make that happen? And I'd say, well, get your program officer to call me and I'll work with them. The object was to work with the funder, not to work with the provider. And so they would organize that and I would talk to, and half the time the program person at the foundation was confused about what was going on. I didn't really understand. And so it was not, it didn't work very smoothly in that sense. And providers, I think, felt like this was a murky process to them in trying to understand how to go about doing this. So that was a sort of an implementation challenge, I would say. The other challenge was that I think we ended up making investments based on much less information than we typically require in a competitive investment. Although we didn't, I feel like, made any bad investments or anything that didn't pan out, I do think it is a substantially lesser standard compared to what we ask others to do. And this is of some concern to staff. The other issue was sometimes that the grant applications that people are putting into foundations, because they didn't know if they could access CHIF funds to match that, they were not particularly right-sized, okay? So they might have asked the foundation for $250, and then we would be putting in another $250 on top of that, but the application didn't really contemplate a program, $500,000 program. It contemplated a $250. So in some cases, what that meant was the foundation saw us as a way to make up money they didn't want to give, right? So he said, okay, well, we'll give them $125, you give them $125, they'll still get their whole $250, and the project will be the right size, but it's smaller than it might have otherwise been. While it leveraged, and it's not to say that foundation didn't put other money to good use in other categories that are important to us. So I don't want to, it's not like the money was not well spent, but it maybe didn't leverage as much as it might have been able to leverage if it had been done differently. As far as being local matching funds, that piece didn't really work out very well. We got only one request in the 4 years that it was active, and turns out they didn't get their grant, so they didn't get used for that purpose. I think there might be some things we could futz with there. Probably to do a bit more outreach to get people to know about it. Also, the other thing was that under the Bush administration, there weren't a tremendous number of federal grants available in our funding areas, so I think that partly just wasn't a lot out there. And then last, I would say the structure of this didn't particularly support what I would call a true collaborative initiative between funders, which would mean something that looks more like funders come together, decide they are interested in funding X in the community, and figure out how to collaboratively march forward and fund that, or maybe they're interested in a particular result. We want more kids ready to learn, or we want more whatever, something. And they set out to devise a way to make that happen and work together to do it. There was none of that, really, because this was all built around applications rather than funder-side collaboration. So those were kind of the challenges, I would say, that we found in working with it. That said, we made a lot of good investments in some programs that were excellent, and there's some on the back page there if you just want to refresh your memory as to what they were. It's not an exhaustive list, but it hits some of the big ones. So one of the things that we asked for when we went out, if you recall, in the beginning process, we did a lot of input gathering in the community out there prior to CHIF passing for the second time. Sorry, PCL passing, Portland Children's Levy passing again. And so we did get some feedback on the leverage fund in particular, and I wanted to kind of use this opportunity to pass that back because I think we got some interesting ideas about other ways we might structure that. A couple people said, why don't you use a challenge grant model instead? So instead of sort of trying to go with the funder side, which was problematic, let the provider or the person who wants to offer the service come and propose something to you, but then they do propose that larger project, but they propose to get half the money or however much you mandate from another source. And you don't give your money until they secure that funding. So you're still leveraging, but they're doing legwork for you, and you're sure that the project is right-sized, and you can ask for whatever information you want about the project on the front end, so you could make the same standards more or less apply, right, for the RFI. So I thought that was an idea worth bringing to you all, because I thought that, and it's used by a lot of foundations, and I guess Robert Wood Johnson was the one that she was giving examples like it, but I think many foundations use this. The other thing that came up with something that Alyssa has worked on was the sort of the true collaborative model of funding, and there's an early childhood funders group that's come together and done a lot of learning for the last year and a half about. They've just asked us to be a part of that group. Alyssa's already been sitting on it, and I thought that might be an interesting way to think about working with other funders is to, since we're on the group now, to think about how we might use that group or walk together with that group to jointly fund something in the early childhood arena that was of mutual interest. So our investment would be leveraged by theoretically the investments of many other foundations who are participating there. And then last was another suggestion that came up at Grantmakers, was to form a collaboration committee with potentially one of you all sitting on it, as well as other folks in the community, other funders in the community, or potentially other people in the community, not just funders, who would be interested in working on making more collaborative funding happen, more public-private ventures, if you want to think of it that way, and trying to use them as an idea base and potentially as a legwork base too, to try to get some of that going in some other funding area. I mean, in early childhood there is a mechanism, I think, there, but in some of our other funding areas where there isn't an obvious mechanism for that. So those were some ideas, could all be pursued at the same time. But we were interested in hearing, I think, the purpose of this discussion from staff's perspective, and you, besides just getting your input in general, is to be thinking about what do we want to do for next time? What kinds of directions do you want us to be heading in crafting something, new guidelines? Again, we also want to hear from the public out there, whoever attends our meetings, to hear what they would suggest too. But before we even start putting anything on paper, we kind of wanted to hear what general direction would you like us to move in putting something on paper? Do you want to keep it exactly the same? Are you interested in some of these other ideas? Do you have other ideas about how to do it? So that's kind of the purpose of this discussion.
The one that speaks to me the most out of just the three, and they're all great, is the challenge grant model. One, I'm just thinking on then the capacity. It probably even would help staff because then you don't have to do that legwork. One, so even helping that admin overhead for the staff, but then for the nonprofit organization, they have to do their due diligence. They have to go out, they have to conceive and conceptualize that program and look at the budget, et cetera. So that would be the one that speaks to me the most. Besides this, just a question that I have, and it would be for eligibility, going back to all those other grantees or the grant organizations that applied for expansion. Would this be an area that they could use as an opportunity to apply for leverage funds because we didn't expand their program, or is this solely for new organizations to apply? That would be something, a question out there.
Yeah, I think that's something that you all should think about, because staff does not have a preconception one way or the other.
And assuming they have a foundation that wants to at least match whatever.
Right.
If we didn't, expand it in the other process, this is another area they can come back to.
I think when we first started or were thinking about the leverage fund, it was more, there were these foundations out there and kind of magically they would just want to invest with us. And, I think the reality is that probably the challenge grant is the better way to go, and we have the infrastructure with every grantee that's already applied for funds. And they could use this and go back to, whoever might be some of their big funders or people on the board or somebody who has an idea that wants to give more, and they can just expand a program that we already have with that challenge grant model. So, it's not really inventing the wheel, it's just adding more capacity through a quasi-challenge grant leverage fund.
Thoughts?
I think I agree that the challenge grant approach is probably the way to go after 5 years of sort of doing the foundation-based approach. However, I guess I would want absolute clarity that it has to be based on, investing in a specific program as opposed to, us just matching any matching grant that comes in the door for an organization. So that we're not just there to, so they can, an organization can say, well, if you give $10,000 to us now, it'll be matched by the Children's Investment Fund for general support. In other words, there has to be a specific proposal that we're funding based on, and the foundation support would have to be linked absolutely with us. That we're both doing this.
Mm-hmm. So the concept would be more that you make a proposal to us, and then you go out and seek your private funding, as opposed to, well, we happen to have gotten a grant from Meyer for $10,000 in October, and now we're going to come to you to match that kind of thing. So it's a go forward, is what you're saying. It sounds like to me. Okay. And that we would want the specs about the program. In other words, it's not just general gifts, which they never were. We've never done that, so I can't see that we would ever. I don't think people would be confused about that.
No, but we did get some inquiries about that.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we need to be absolutely clear.
Just be clear that it is for program services-based funding.
I like all the ideas that you have here. The thing I like about the challenge grant is, yes, it puts the legwork not as much on you, but it also acts more as a real leverage. Like, okay, we're willing to go forward if you, private foundations, will also. So I think it really is more of a leverage fund in some ways. The Early Child Collaborative, I know one of the things they're looking at now throughout the whole state is, can we form parenting hubs? There are so many parenting initiatives or program delivery systems out there, organizations doing it. Can we act like the Oregon Mentors Association, where we really support an organization that will work as a hub and will help all the different parenting programs out there to establish quality guidelines, all those kind of things around parenting curriculum. So I like that idea. I don't know that has to be exclusive from the challenge grant. No. The group that the nonprofit that might receive the parenting hub, I'm just using parenting as an example because that's one of the most concrete things that's coming out of this for now, could come and ask for a challenge grant. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. The other way that could go is we put it into pooled funds at OCF, and I think that is too iffy for now and maybe too far outside of what we generally do in terms of contributing directly to nonprofits. So I wouldn't necessarily argue for that. I think there's ways to get around it. But I think being a part of collaboratives is, part of it is leveraging funding, and part of it is acting in a more holistic way with other funders at the table. So I like that too. And then the putting together a collaborative committee, I think, is a great idea.
I think with the challenge grant, the foundations will understand it better as well, so you won't have as much confusion.
And I think it gives an order to the process, which was another tricky part last time. Was they're like, okay, well, you're voting tonight. Okay, well, how soon can I get a meeting to get our vote? Like, at least it makes it clear that we would you guys would all look at an application. You would decide whether this is something you want to do. You would make the decision, and then they would have that commitment, and we would encumber the funds until they get an answer, or give them a certain amount of time. And I guess we have to give them a certain amount of time, probably, to come up with it, because you wouldn't want to leave it open forever. Otherwise, you could make the grant for somebody else.
I think some of the other things that I might just throw out as questions are, should we lower that minimum from 250 to 100? Can we be a part of a match where there are four or five different funders, each putting in 100,000? I don't know that your rules now.
There was no limitation in the past about how many private funders it could be. It didn't matter.
And then can in-kind, a group like Social Venture Partners, who gives a lot of in-kind support. They work actually on developing management information systems. I know that's tricky to put a number to that, but are there other ways that we can be flexible toward the match? Another question I have is, are we looking at doing this once a year, $1 million for each year, so that there's emerging needs that come up a year or two from now might have access? What would our timetable for this be? Are there certain areas that we feel that have been underfunded that we would highlight? And then do groups that may have had leverage funds in the past, like Library Foundation, that did not get as much in this particular round? Certain of the leverage funds, I believe, like Saturday Academy and some others, were kind of wrapped into the grant-making process, and others got a lot less than they had gotten in a leverage fund. So how do we value, again, like the same question about new versus continuing programs, continuation of services versus the innovation of being able to try something new? Those are just some of the things I'd love to hear from the public in trying to figure out how to structure this.
Maybe just a little aside was I was talking to a company owner who was asking about potential leverage fund where not necessarily a foundation, but the company itself would pick a children's issue that they could get behind, both from employees and raising funds for that particular children's group, and then have the children's levy match what they were, as a company, willing to do. Mm-hmm. And so, maybe something like that is also something to put on the website of, if there's a company out there.
I guess that's what I find problematical, is that approach.
His question, though.
If it's just generalized support.
For a program. For a specific program. In the areas that we already are in. Not something different, but a proven program that maybe we already support. Maybe it's one of the grantees that gets a company to go along with them, and we match that, what they're able to get that company to come in.
Yeah, again, if it's around a specific proposal.
Right.
Yeah, and I like everything Alyssa said, but I'm not sure about the in-kind matching. That's kind of government's domain. We always match our grants with income. Anyway, I just raised that as a question mark. But no, I think there's been a lot of good discussion here, and the timing. Do we make all $3 million available whenever we adopt new guidelines, or do we, do $1 million a year? I think those are interesting discussion.
Well, I think you also have to think about how long you want to allow something to be encumbered for. Once you approve something on a challenge grant basis, then we would encumber the funds until they're able to raise. There has to be some time period in which they have to raise the remaining funds, right? Because otherwise it would just be encumbered indefinitely, and then it would be sitting there and not going to anything. So I think there would have to be some kind of timeline, and that would maybe. It might make it better to do more up front, because then you put it out there, because some are not going to succeed, right? And so then you have to start. Then you can unencumber the funds and make it open again. So.
And then what about the issue of local matches for federal or state grants? Are you saying?
I think that the problem was it was really unused, and so it's not that we couldn't still make that available. We may want to consider I think we asked for grant applications probably too far in advance of when they were due because most people are last-minute preparers. Mm-hmm. So we'd probably have to be willing to function on a more last-minute basis for that, which I think since it wasn't overwhelming last time, I think we probably could do that. I don't know whether we want to lower the size. Maybe 100,000 was too large for a local match for those grants. I mean, I think, I'm not sure. I don't know what the problem was.
We want to maintain, I guess we had a higher leverage factor for local match. To be a local match, 2-to-1, right? We had to get at least $2 in federal or state for every $1 we put in, whereas
which is
under our general leverage fund, we're talking at least $1 for dollar.
Right.
So we want to maintain that difference.
I mean, I could be wrong. I don't think that was probably the issue because most times the local match that is required is usually substantially less than what they're giving you, right? I mean, and so they don't. It would be rare that they would say you have to come up with as much as we're giving you. I would say certainly not from the feds. It's more like probably 10 to 20% local match. But again, there's not been a lot of federal grants available in our funding areas to apply for. So I don't know if that might, if that's going to shift or not. It might. You never know. As far as more national foundations, we just don't seem to have people successful at or going for sort of East Coast Foundation dollars that sometimes, the ones I'm thinking of that I've read about do require local matches of people. People get Gates money here. They're a national, international foundation, but not, a little bit, Robert Wood Johnson's son. I mean, there's not tons of that money here. So I don't know how useful that is.
That's a good point if we just want to have it as flexible as possible. A 1-to-1, for instance, Gates always says they don't want to be the biggest funder. So they wouldn't do a 2-to-1 match with us. For federal, I think that's true. Often, if we put in 100,000, it'll bring in $1 million. But for the private national funders, that may not be true.
Well, then you'd have to just get clear about which category, I guess, they fall into. Maybe we only make it for federal grants or something, or federal state grants. The state has no money, so that's unlikely to bring much. But because now you get. I mean, Gates, I would say, would typically function on the challenge. I mean, they could be a piece of a challenge grant. In other words, I think it'd probably make more sense to do that rather than to do it as. So maybe we reconceive of that as a local match for government grants of some kind.
I also like Ron's idea because I think it offers more opportunity for organizations to look at other routes to fundraise if they're not going the foundation route. They're then being creative, and it actually will probably help build capacity because if they're getting employees in the company to help fundraise, then that means that they're bringing awareness about their organization locally. So then they may have more donors even after that point, which I think, what we're looking at is how do we also develop not only capacity but sustainability within the organization. So I really like that idea.
Yeah, and I think, the ability for us to participate in collaborative funding efforts with other foundations is a good thing. I mean, having those, being at the table, having those discussions
is worthwhile.
Given some guidelines we have under which we operate, but yeah, I think that's...
I think we have to go to that group a little more and try to understand maybe where they're. I miss them. In other words, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I have a lot of intelligence to pass on at this point about what that might look like because I think. I'd say, and I've read about funders collaboratives in other places, and they function to the point where the people who are part of the collaborative are putting money into, committing funds that they have power over into, investments that are meant to deliver certain outcomes. I would say the most typical way that I saw it structured, and I looked at maybe 3 different ones in early childhood in different places. So they were looking around outcomes, and they were all committing their money into, and then the specific investments they made went from there. Does that make sense? So it's sort of like a little mini special purpose foundation that functioned for a period of time to do certain things. One was around that daycare one they did in California, child care one. So anyway, I don't know that this group is heading that way or that would even be a possibility. Maybe that's not really reality. It might take us a little more time to understand what could or couldn't be done with that. But I thought it was at least worth exploring maybe.
Any other thoughts on leverage fund? I guess we're at the end of our meeting. We will be having 2 allocation committee meetings to get feedback on what we've discussed today. The next one will be at City Hall right here, November 13th, 12:30 to 2:30. And then we will meet again on December 14th from 9 to 11 a.m. So we hope to see everyone there. And for now, we stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.